All right, well, I want to give you a whirlwind tour through the brain. And it's very difficult. The brain is incredibly complex, and I'm not going to pretend that it's not. So it might get confusing, but I'll try my best. I'm going to summarize some stuff that was in this book. And like many of you, I'm interested in these big questions. I'll try to address at least the first one there, and attention. All right, so what is consciousness and what is it for? Well, it seems to be the presentation to within our bodies of what's going on in the world and in our bodies so that we can plan and act in that world. So some people might think of it as a kind of virtual reality that mirrors reality, presumably, but it's full of interpretation. Some people have thought of it as a kind of veridical hallucination. But I think it's pretty important to think about how it unfolds in your brain. So let's say you go outside and you see that the ground is wet. Well, that's a highly interpreted interpretation of this very ambiguous pattern of two-dimensional pixel activations on your retina. Certainly there's no concrete on your retina or anything like that. So within about a quarter of a second from the original retinal activation, there's a full-blown analysis of all kinds of things, basically trying to reverse engineer what's going on in the world based upon what's going on the retina, given all kinds of assumptions about that image-to-world mapping. And you might say that there's two kinds of inferences going on. One is a pre-conscious, automatic, unconscious inference of what's going on in the world right now. And that becomes your conscious experience. Then, based upon that conscious experience, after consciousness, you might say, the ground is wet. Well, maybe it rained. Oh, no, wait, the sky is blue. Okay, well, maybe a gardener came by with a hose. No, but today's Sunday. So those cognitive inferences are very slow and open-ended. But the pre-conscious, unconscious, rapid inferences that take place in that quarter second between the retinal activation and your full-blown conscious experience of a wet sidewalk, that's what I want to focus on. So most philosophers talk mainly about this second kind of inference as inference, but really, I think a lot of people have come to understand that there's a lot of inferential processing in the construction of your conscious experience. All right, so I want to sum up here hundreds of papers about what consciousness is and what it's for. The essence, I think, is that consciousness is required for endogenous or volitional attentional allocation, shifting, and tracking. And volitional executive control, flexible cognitive processing and manipulation of representations in executive working memory, complex concatenations of simpler mental operations, contextually appropriate management of detected errors, and effective top-down inhibition of imminent acts. Okay, that sounds like a mouthful, but that's a summary of 30 years of a whole field about what consciousness is for. So it's for something. It allows us to plan and act in our world. Our world is our consciousness. Okay. And so qualia, I would argue, are the informational format that volitional attentional operations can access and operate on. And we're born with a kind of basis set of those, like, say, sweetness, sourness, saltiness, and so forth. But a lot of them can be learned. So you can actually wire up a qual of pineapple, such that you can taste a Thai coconut soup and say, it's got coconut in it, it's got pineapple in it. You didn't come to the world with a pineapple qual, but you wired one up. All right, qualia. Okay, so bam, that pops out. Red pops out. Green pops out, right? But where's the oddball here? Where's the one that's red on the left and green on the right? I think you probably just experienced a big smush of red and green. It's there. Right? So you have a qual for red, you have a qual for green, but you probably don't have a qual for red on the left and green on the right. In order to find that, you'd have to allocate your attention to that location, and then it would be bound together. And then you say, oh, there it is. But with practice, you could become expert in finding things that are red on the left and green on the right, and you would, I would argue, develop a qual for red on the left and green on the right. Okay, now here, that pops out, vertical, but that doesn't pop out. Where's the green vertical one? Well, you'll have to search around. If you were lucky, you allocated your attention there, and you found it. But you didn't come to the world. You have green qual, you have vertical qual, but the binding of red and green and vertical is not for most of you immediate. But it would be with practice. And so I would argue that what we call qual are very much tied up with this experience of pop-out or immediacy. And I would argue furthermore that we can wire up new qual and bring things to the point of pop-out with practice. So if our world has a lot of a particular kind of feature conjunction in it, say cheetahs or leopards, we will become very sensitive to that. And then if there's a leopard out there, boom, we'll find it right away and experience it immediately. So we can make experimental predictions that if there is a qual for something, we can find out if people experience it at a pop-out level. And so what we do in my lab, one of the things we do in my lab is to try to wire up new expertises. One would be this case of finding red on the left among green on the left, distractors. And this should be hard for you, but for an expert to find it as fast as you found red among green. Here's another case. After a week or two of practice, that target will pop out. And so for that person, they experience it in an immediate way, as immediately as you, say, experience your name. You didn't come to the world knowing your name, but now it's become a kind of immediate experience because you, I would argue, wired up neural systems that detect that. All right, so this is the kind of brain data that we do in my lab. We try to find out where this learning is taking place. We can show that people get faster and faster and better with over several days. And then we look for the parts of the brain where those things seem to be wiring up. And in this case, we find they seem to be wiring up in early visual areas. Okay, so here's a 3D picture of my brain. Here's somebody else's brain, sort of a medial section. And we know that the different cortical areas are connected with these sort of highways of axons. And now fancy imaging techniques allow us to image that. You might think that this is sort of like a highway, but it's not like a highway. It's much more like, so connecting these different cortical cells, it's much more like a system not of cables or of highways, it's much more like the railway system. Because there's tremendous flexibility in how things are connected with each other. And if you look at a railway system, it has these shunts. So if I want to connect, say, New York City to San Diego, depending on how the shunts are connected, I can create lots of different connectivities. So people who are after the connectome are really, they think they're going to get it just by looking at the map of the train system. It's not enough, because you're going to have to understand how the shunting works. So the shunting, I argue in that book, is really the center piece of the neural code. It's not action potentials per se. They're sort of like the trains going down the tracks. The real neural code is about how these shunts work, such that I can create sort of epi-connectivities between any 2 points. So the real heart of the matter is not connectivity, but epi-connectivity, how things happen to be linked at any moment via these shunts. Now, the brain doesn't have shunts, it has synaptic weights. And these synaptic weights can be changed on a millisecond time scale. Right. So then the question is, if the real neural code is not happening at the level of neural firing, but at the level of rapid synaptic reweighting on a millisecond timescale, how are we going to possibly figure out how this works? I don't think it's going to be easy. I think it's going to be really hard technologically. But at least in terms of ideas, we can know what to go after. Then the question is, how does something like an idea go down and change synaptic weights? You know, I can give you a command like, think of your mother's maiden name. Boom. You can recall that. I can say, okay. I can give you some criteria like, think of a woman politician. Okay, so you might have thought of Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, Hillary Clinton. Why did you think of that one versus any other? Well, it wasn't random, right? You didn't think of ants dancing with top hats, right? You thought of a woman politician. I gave you some criteria. It's a woman, it's a politician. So it's not utterly random. It had to be a woman politician. But had I rewound the universe, given the incredible amount of noise in the brain, and the brain seems to harness noise for purposes like this, you might have said somebody different than you thought. Or you might have thought of somebody different this time. So there's a kind of middle ground between complete determinism, where things have to play out like a movie, and utter randomness, where just random stuff happens. That is the constraining of what will happen next, harnessing chance to meet criteria. And so I would argue the brain is constantly rewiring itself on a moment by moment basis to fulfill the criteria that best meet its needs. All right. So now this is where things get complicated. And I won't get into the whole explanation, but people in my field are trying to figure out how this sort of sensory signal works up through the brain and how these top-down areas, these executive areas, come down and govern these bottom-up signals. And we're making a lot of progress. Here's a kind of best guess in a monkey brain about how this might work. So the blue stuff is the bottom-up signal. Your eyes would be under here. It flows back to the back of the brain, then it flows forward. But meanwhile, you've got all these executive areas. Those are the red arrows, feeding in a top-down way, manipulating these bottom-up signals. So there's this deep embrace between bottom-up signals and volitional attention, especially coming down and deciding what's going on out there in the world. And we have dedicated neural systems that seem to play a role in this. The central one seems to be this cholinergic system, rooted in what's called the basal forebrain. And it sort of spritzes acetylcholine into synaptic clefts that are involved in bottom-up signals that you, in a top-down way, are attending, altering their properties in really interesting ways. But I'm not going to get into all that. It's very complicated. I want to try to get 4 take-home messages in this talk, okay? And I'm going to go through them one by one. And I'm going to show some kind of demos so you will have subjective experiences tied to these ideas. The first is that preconscious operations transform detected 2D visual inputs into a conscious experience of a 3D world within about a quarter of a second after retinal activation. So I'm going to walk through some data first and then give you some demos. So here's some nice data, not by my group, but by Stan Haynes' group, where they're trying to contrast cases where you see something with cases where you don't. So what they do is they'll show some pattern, like those pound signs, then a word, then some other things that mask it. And often people will say, I didn't see it, because it's so fast. And then he'll contrast that with cases where it really wasn't there. And then there'll be the case where people always see it, right? So if you don't have this event after the word, then this won't be matched and everybody will see it. So you can do some, with clever paradigms like this, you can try to contrast cases where people see something with cases where they don't see something. And so they did this with EEG, and now we're looking at about 100 milliseconds after the presentation of the word. There's no difference between the case where it's not visible and the case where it is visible. By 180 milliseconds, still not much of a difference. This is 180 milliseconds after the word showed up on the screen. But at about 250, 300 milliseconds, you start to see differences. In the case where people didn't see it, you don't get much activation in these downstream areas. So let me get here. This would be your forehead here. This is the back of the brain. Visual signals come in the back of the brain and then flow down this way. In the case where you don't see it, you're not conscious of the word, the signal seems to peter out. But in the case where you do see it, it continues on. And then now we're at 436 milliseconds, and information seems to flow to the frontal lobes, especially in the case where you saw it. Here's a view after half a second from a different angle, and so forth. And I won't get into all the details, but they had people rank, I'm totally sure I saw that word. I'm not so sure I saw that word, or I saw something, but I know, but I don't know what it was. And then I definitely didn't see the word. And there are certain brain signals that vary with the degree to which you feel you saw it. So, look at the gold one. or the purple one, if you're really sure you saw it, you got this big signal out here in the frontal lobes, and that's at about 300, 400 milliseconds. In this earlier, so this is your eyeballs would be here, this is the back of the brain. Signals are flowing down like this. Here, in this fusiform area, you get earlier signals around 200, 250 that correlate with the degree to which you say you saw it. So gold, here is I saw it for sure, and then as you go down, 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 blue you say, I'm not sure at all, I think I didn't see it. Then it goes down. So we have brain signals that correlate with the degree to which you feel you were conscious of something. And these components in electroencephalograms are the N2 and the P3. Okay, so I'm going to try to give you a big picture of how this might unfold in the brain without getting into lots of detail. So this is a brain. Again, this would be your forehead. This is the back of the brain. The signals flow from the eyes, via the thalamus, to V1 and then down. And this section of the brain seems to be very central for your conscious experience. All right, so we have these N1 and P1 components that seem to be observable whether or not somebody was conscious of something. Now here is the first signal we get in the brain that seems to vary with the degree to which someone is conscious of something at about 200, 250 milliseconds. And in these areas, the frontal lobes, and then again here, we get this P300, which again varies to the degree to which someone feels that they were conscious of something. All right, so to try to understand this, we have to think about different kinds of information buffers. And in neuroscience, people talk about different kinds of memory systems. And there's a sort of standard model where there's retinal input, a very rapid short-term buffer on the order of 100 milliseconds is fed into another buffer, eventually to another buffer, short-term memory and working memory. These can hold onto information as long as you will to attend to them. And then things get stored in a sort of ROM or long-term memory. So let's relate those buffers to these different signals. This visual buffer seems to be going on in these very early visual areas in a dedicated way, regardless of whether you're conscious of it or not. These short-term memory areas seem to be going on in these sort of midstream visual areas. And then we've got the frontal lobes and the parietal lobes that are involved in working memory, where you can manipulate things. And I can say to you, imagine an egg with wings that is flying around the Statue of Liberty holding an ice cream cone instead of a torch. And you can do that in your working memory. You have tremendous freedom in your working memory. In fact, I would argue, separate talk, that those operations that we might call the imagination are the root of free will, actually not meaningless finger motions. All right, sorry, then you have long-term memory in the hippocampal system. So I'm going to just try to show some demos now associated with early vision. Okay, so here's a very nice consciousness demo. Your task is to fixate that little tiny dot in the middle. And don't move your head, don't move your eyes. And if you do that very carefully, you'll notice that the pink, which is in fact always there on the screen, will vanish from your consciousness. And it will seem like the whole thing becomes a uniform color. Now that's an interesting illusion, and I can explain it, but it would take too long. But basically, your cortex doesn't know what's going on in the world, right? This is, since we're talking amongst Buddhists here, I'll give you a kind of koan from neuroscience. What lies beyond the farthest constellation that you can see? And the answer is your skull, because it's all happening inside this black box. So neurons in the cortex are not responding to the world, they're responding to their inputs in utter darkness. Now, you'll notice that there's a fuzzy boundary here. So retinal ganglion cells, or neurons in your retina, stop firing because there's not enough change when you're making tiny eye movements. So they adapt. So they stop firing. The cortex says, oh, these neurons are not firing very much. There must be nothing there. Oh, well, I'll fill in the color from here in. All right. I'll show you some other sort of low-level visual effects. Now, you've all seen after images, right? So You now fixate that black spot. And now when I replace it with a gray field, you'll see the opposite color, the opponent color, right? And so the colors you see now are totally in your head. They're not there in reality. So that's happening entirely because of retinal and early visual circuitry. Here's another example of a low-level consequence of how we're wired up. So here, I'll give you a better example. You'll probably notice that there's a kind of weird shadow at the white crosses, but there's not one at the particular shadow you're looking directly at. And so I can explain that in terms of retinal computations, because there's something called a receptive field, which is what a neuron responds to in the world. And certain kinds of receptive fields in the retina like light hitting the center, but they don't like light hitting the surround. Now in the fovea, your center surround receptive fields are tiny, so this is the situation for whichever one you're looking at. But for the crosses in the periphery, the white crosses in the periphery, there's an asymmetry between the amount of excitation and the amount of inhibition, where there's more inhibition here, 1, 2, 3, 4 units of inhibition versus just 1, 2 units of inhibition here. So you get this, as a consequence, you get this illusion. This is all going on as a consequence of early retinal and early visual area computations. Right. Okay. Next take-home message. Information is not merely transformed, but is constructed in light of operations, pre-conscious, rapid, unconscious operations that embody assumptions about the image sequence to world mapping. So you're trying to reverse engineer, how did I get this image? What kind of world created that? So the Gestalt psychologists argue that there's all these grouping operations. I think they're correct. Some of my work is trying to figure out what those operations are. So here's an example. Raise your hand if you see this as vertical motion. Raise your hand if you see this as horizontal motion. Okay, so most of you see it vertically. Cover the lower half with your hand. This will force the top star to move horizontally. Now move your hand away. So now, who sees it horizontally now if you did that? Many more of you. So, with training, you can volitionally control this, and you can choose to see horizontal motion or vertical motion. Now, this is just two images. Right? And when that police car stops you, you see apparent motion in the lights, even though cognitively you know there's no light bulb jumping back and forth. All right, here's another example of this kind of illusion. Here I'm just taking those two images, and watch what your brain does when I replace one image with the other. It creates a kind of story where you're seeing analog motion, but you know cognitively that there isn't any. So these grouping operations that precede consciousness and go into the construction of consciousness have all kinds of assumptions built into them, like objects don't disappear into nowhere, objects don't appear out of nowhere, objects tend to be transformations of existing objects, and so forth. So this bar in the middle will always come on, in fact, all at once. Watch what your brain does, depending on the context. So what many people report is that when this bar appears, in fact, all at once, it looks like it shoots down. So this motion is attributed to that guy. All this middle bar gets attributed to that guy, and it's to shoot that way. So there's a lot of pretty high-level pre-conscious, unconscious inferences going on that have all kinds of assumptions, including very ecological assumptions. All right, so that was mid-level vision. Here's some more. We are constructing whole 3D scenes and interpreted objects. I can take something ambiguous like this, and probably most of you see this as sort of a black rings around a column. But now in your mind, flip it so it's really bracelets with a gap in front, where the gap is in front. Now, if it's floating bracelets, suddenly you won't get the same illusory contours. So I'm very interested in these kinds of grouping operations that create 3D scenes, but also 3D interpretations of material. Okay, what is this? What was that? What kind of legs? Wet legs, right? Female wet legs. So everybody saw shiny legs? Okay. So this young teenager on Instagram, my daughter showed this to me, put toothpaste on her legs just where the highlights would be. And so it looks, but your brain, created a story. It's shiny, glossy, wet legs or oil-colored legs. So these kinds of inferences are constantly going on, and they create your conscious experience. Here's another set of such operations, color constancy. Now, if I take a picture of this desk under fluorescent or incandescent light, the camera responds to it radically differently, but my eyes wouldn't. Color constancy is remarkable in that it takes retinal information and recovers from it pigment. So here the brown is recovered, here orange is recovered, but at the level of the image, these are identical activations on the screen. Now, why is that? Because the image is incredibly ambiguous. I can take a single number, say a gray value. Some percentage of that is due to pigment or reflected, some percentage is due to the illuminant or the sunshine, some percentage is due to shadow, some percentage is due to transparent layers. And in that quarter of a second, my brain has to say, okay, forget all that other stuff. This is what the pigment is. And your conscious experience is of the presumed pigment. So one goal of consciousness is to recover what is intrinsically true about the world. The true shape, the true size, true distance, true trajectory, true pigment. Disregarding all the seemingly irrelevant things. So if you have a white cat running under a blue light, you don't want to see it as a blue cat. You want to see it as a white cat that happens to be under blue light. So you have to recover the pigment. But that's not in the image. That has to be constructed. So here's two images made by some artists. Those two arrows point to identical image level picture wavelengths, but you experience one as the pigment blue and the other as the pigment red, and I can prove it to you by moving it over. So now you see them next to each other, and now you can see they're the same, but in a different context. Right? And so there's a kind of cognitive impenetrability to all of this. You can't reach down past your conscious experience to the information that went into the construction of your conscious experience to recover, to experience this as what's going on at the image level. That's not it. Because what's the point of that? You want your conscious experience to be a story about what's going on in the world and the body, about what's intrinsically true, as best your system can guess it. This is another famous example. A and B have the same image level luminances. Now this Japanese artist, Akihiro Kitaoka, has drawn lots of these very nice examples. Here the skin levels are identical at the image, but your experience is that this is a light-skinned girl and that is a dark-skinned girl. Here, the irises are identical in the image, but you're experiencing this as a blue pigment, and this is a gray pigment. But I can prove to you that, I'm going to just drag her eyes over, and I can even blow it up. So the gray level is the same, but that's not true of your conscious experience. Here, this is the same color in the image as that, but you're probably experiencing this pigment to be the same as that pigment. Some of this is so hard to believe you have to actually sit down and measure it. Right? So here I've dragged over the two eyes, and in fact, I'll blow it up. So you can see that the image level colors are identical at the iris, but certainly not at the level of your conscious experience. Some other examples. Right? So this is actually gray in the image, same like gray, but you experience it as that. This is actually the same gray as that, you experience it as that. Why? Because the visual system is trying to recover what's intrinsically true, the pigment. And if this is presumed to be a girl behind a red transparent layer or a red light, you want to discount that to recover what's intrinsically true. If you pass a blue thing through a red filter, you'll get gray. Now you have to reverse engineer that. I detected gray, but under the assumption there's a red filter, it's got to be blue. Same for size, right? So these are famous examples of size constancy. We experience these women as the same size in the world. If I drag that woman and back up front, she looks like a tiny woman. But in the image, they're identical. I just grabbed her and dragged her forward. here's a rock on my property, and this might look very strange, until you realize it's upside down. It was actually a concave rock. Now, we don't go through life assuming that rocks are concave rather than they're convex. And so if I give you some shape like this, you're interpreting this very ambiguous image under all kinds of assumptions, like I'm viewing from above, is one of them. And objects tend to be convex over concave. If I flip the image upside down, look what happens to the nubble in the middle. It now becomes sort of a valley. So there's an incredible amount of interpretation going on in that quarter second leading up to your conscious experience. All right, take-home message number 3. Pre-conscious processing is not only bottom-up, because top-down processing can reach down and bias the construction of the contents of consciousness by those pre-conscious operations. So I'll give you some examples. Let's see. Let's do it this way. People who are female, close your eyes. People who are male, keep your eyes open. Okay, now, males, close your eyes. And females, open your eyes. Okay, now everybody open your eyes. Raise your hands if you saw that as the head of a donkey. So there goes the men. Raise your hands if you saw that as a baby seal. There goes the women. So what I showed you is either this, or I showed you this. And then I showed you this ambiguous thing, which could be the head of a donkey or a baby seal. So this would be a case of semantic or biasing of the pre-conscious operations, so that when you saw this, you'd interpret it as consistent with what you were biased to see. All right. In the interest of time, I want to skip that. All right, here's another case. This is something else we've done in the lab. So these are just, this is not just a Venn diagram. Fixate, say, the middle dot, and volitionally attend to one disk, whichever one you want. And whichever disk you attend to, you might notice, seems to become more opaque and darker, and maybe move to the back. So you can play with your own volitional attention and change your experienced brightnesses. Does that seem to work for some people? Yeah. Okay, now this case is the flip. You pay attention to whichever disk you want, and it should now seem to become brighter and more opaque, and maybe in the back. So your volitional attention now can alter the qualia at the level of brightnesses. Here's true for color too, So fixate the center. The center is always gray, but if you attend to one of those colors, the whole disk, it seems to become that color disk in the background. So even at the level of color, volitional attention can seem to bias which color becomes central to your experience. All right, so I'm going to give you another example of top-down control of bottom-up processes. So first notice that there's nothing here inside this. Now fixate this spot really carefully, and you're going to create an after image. And I'm going to tell you what you're going to see, just to speed things up. In about 20 seconds, I'm going to have you move your eyes over to that other dot, but don't do it yet. So you're adapting your retinal ganglion cells. Now, when you see that after image, you'll be able to take volitional control of the after image by either paying attention to the horizontal or paying attention to the vertical box. So in about 10 seconds, I want you to shift your attention, your eyes over to the dot on the other side. You'll see a very strong after image, and then you'll volitionally choose to see horizontal bars by paying attention to the horizontal box, or you'll see vertical bars by paying attention to the vertical box. Okay, now everybody shift their eyes to the other side. You'll see a strong after image. Control your after image with your own will. All right. Okay, I've got only 5 minutes. I want to speed up. I want to skip that one. I was going to show this demo. Let's see. I won't have time to show all the demos, but this is a nice one. So, most of you probably see this as sort of bars expanding and contracting. But I can convince you now to see this in a radically different way. Imagine now that there's 4 white, opaque, square pieces of paper, and you're looking at that cross-shaped gap. Through that gap, suddenly you'll see an ellipse rotating behind those 4 pieces of paper. Can anyone see that? Now notice when you see it suddenly, it's like, wow, And there's even other interpretations of this, but... okay, and I want to show you... Okay, I love demos. I have to show you one more demo. Okay, so here is another thing we've been doing in the lab, where we're very interested in top-down control of qualia, essentially. So let me walk through this. You'll see that the red spots, in fact, appear at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, somewhere. There. That's the reality. You can alter that reality pretty radically with your attention by fixating the blue spot in the middle, and now attend only to, say, the black layer. Choose 2 of the outside black dots and track them with your attention, maintaining fixation. And now notice where the red dots are. The red dots are no longer at 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. They kind of go to 11 o'clock and 5 o'clock. Then, with your volitional attention, pay attention only to the white layer. So, as hard as you can. And you'll notice that the dots seem to shift in the opposite direction now. They should be at 7 o'clock and 1 o'clock. Anyway, some of the stuff is kind of subtle. So I don't know that it will work for everybody, but I only got 2 minutes left, so I want to wrap up. If I can find my talk. Here it is. All right. Okay. All right, so let's wrap it up. So the picture, okay, so then we've got, top-down executive stuff going on in working memory. And this can come down and bias these bottom-up processes. So the whole system is very beautiful. It goes into the construction of your world, your consciousness, with all kinds of pre-conscious, unconscious inferences that can in turn be biased by top-down volitional processes. And I'll skip that. Right, so attention can influence bottom-up processes by specifying the bottom-up processes should happen in this domain and not that domain. And then the bottom-up stuff happens automatically within that domain. So here's a summary. We've got early visual processing, mid-level visual processing, high-level visual processing. And I said that there's pre-conscious operations that are inferential, they're very rapid. They happen in this 250 to 400 milliseconds between retinal activation and your full-blown conscious experience of a world. That world you experience is the story of what's going on in that world and in your body so that you can do stuff in that world and plan. Information is not just transformed, but it's constructed. Your consciousness is a construction full of assumptions. It's not only bottom-up construction, it's also top-down. You can will to alter that bottom-up construction. Because attention can bias what will get that full bottom-up treatment. And all these ideas are in that book, in chapter 10. So thank you.